MMA is a dangerous sport. You have world-class fighters trying their absolute best to inflict damage on their opponents. But there are some boundaries that fighters don't cross. When a referee says a fight is over, it's over. However, for Rousimar Palhares, the fight isn't over until his opponent is screaming in agony.
He's got it. Tap, 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 tap. Oh.
Which is why he's one of the most disliked and dirtiest figures in all of MMA. But let's take a deeper look into what he's done. If you guys are familiar with any superhero movies, you'll know that every villain has an origin story that can make us feel empathetic. Now, Palhares isn't evil or anything, but his actions in MMA have definitely vilified him. So naturally, there is a tragic part to his story. He was born in Brazil and grew up in horrible conditions. By the time he turned 7 years old, he was already working in the fields to help provide food for his family. Palhares even said, quote, "There were times that money was so tight that we had to eat animal feed. We would eat the feed that we gave the pigs. It was a very bad time, and I don't like to talk about it." Eventually, Palhares had to leave his family because there wasn't enough food to feed all 10 members and go live by himself underneath a local bridge and learn how to survive. So when you hear something like that, you can't help but feel bad for the guy. But it's still hard to make excuses for his actions later on. When he was 15, Palhares found an outlet in his life that would change it forever. He enrolled in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school and started to practice the grappling craft. He had the frame of a comic book character as his muscles seemed to have muscles. And you add that elite grappling skill to that, then you have on your hands an extremely dangerous MMA fighter. And Palhares really was dangerous, infamously so. Out of his 19 wins, 16 of them came via submission, and his go-to submission was either knee bars or heel hooks. This is what particularly made Palhares so dangerous. If you get caught in a choke and your opponent holds on a bit longer than necessary, the worst that will happen is that you lose consciousness for a few seconds, but you will largely be okay. But when it comes to leg attacks, the difference between your knee ripping apart and it being okay can be a literal second. So when you have a behemoth like Palhares wrenching at your knee and keeps doing it as the referee interferes, he can leave his opponents permanently damaged. And more than one needed surgery after facing Palhares. The very first incident occurred at UFC 111 against Tonon in 2010. The fight only lasted 45 seconds as Palhares synced in his patented heel hook submission. Tomas tapped several times as Palhares kept the submission pressure, and soon his opponent was screaming in agony as the referee attempted to pry Palhares off of him for a few seconds, before Palhares finally let go and celebrated as if nothing had happened. For his actions, the commission suspended Palhares for 90 days. However, that punishment was hardly severe and seemed to have barely left an impression on him, as it was first of many such offenses. But before we get to the next one, there was also an odd incident in his fight against Dan Miller. He faced Miller at UFC 134, and during the fight, Palhares rocked Miller badly and dropped him. But before the ref could see what was going on, Palhares ran away celebrating and even climbed on top of the octagon to wave to his fans. But the only problem was that the fight wasn't actually called off. The ref had to literally force Palhares down from the octagon and restart the fight. Although this isn't dirty, but it does show how Palhares might not have been all there in his head, as he has this aloof nature to him, which becomes dangerous when combined with his MMA skills. Moving on though, his next big strike came against Mike Pierce in October of 2013. This was fresh off of a 9-month suspension for Palhares, as he previously popped for using performance-enhancing drugs. His return fight didn't last long, as Palhares dove for a heel hook in the starting seconds of the fight and locked it on quickly, forcing Pierce to tap at the 31-second mark of the first round. However, Palhares kept the heel hook in place for several more seconds and only released after the referee literally stuck his head in to break Palhares' grip.
The guy is an asshole, whether it's intentional or not.
Meanwhile, Pierce held on to his leg gingerly afterward, having suffered damage to the tendons in his knee. UFC didn't play 3 strikes and you're out, as they released Palhares after just his second official offense. This was a bit of a shocking release, as Palhares had established himself as an elite contender in the UFC, but he was too much of a liability and a headache for the UFC. He would quickly be picked up by the World Series of Fighting organization, where he fought for their welterweight championship, and once again, he won by a heel hook. And although this time he didn't hold on to it as blatantly as previous attempts, Palhares definitely kept the lock on for an extra bit as Steve Carl tapped. Thankfully, Carl wasn't hurt too badly and would be one of the few men to tap Palhares' heel hooks and be okay afterward. Now you'd think by now Palhares would have learned his lesson, but shockingly enough, his worst offenses were still to come. At World Series of Fighting 22, he defended his welterweight title against John Fitch. Again, it would be long into the fight before Palhares showed off his incredible jiu-jitsu skills as he locked in a knee bar less than 2 minutes into the first round.
He's got him, it's over.
Fitch would tap almost instantly and the referee was in there to break up the hold right away as well, but Palhares kept the pressure going for a few more seconds. Fitch would later say he heard something pop in his knee and would require time off from fighting in order to rehab the injury. But surprisingly enough, World Series of Fighting didn't consider this a punishable offense despite the outcry from MMA media and fans. Maybe by now people were just getting used to Palhares' dirty play. But this then brings us to Palhares' dirtiest MMA moment. At World Series of Fighting 22, Palhares defended his belt once more against UFC and Strikeforce vet Jake Shields. This one would turn ugly real quick, as not only would Palhares commit his patented submission holding foul, but repeatedly eye-gouged Jake Shields to the point that he could barely open his eyes after the fight. Shields looked like he had just survived a horror movie. The referee even warned Palhares several times for his eye gouging, but it seemed to have no effect on him. Things would get even worse for Shields when Palhares kept him in a Kimura lock and forced him to tap. However, Palhares blatantly held on to the submission, damaging Shields' shoulder and arm. Once the referee finally managed to get Palhares to release the submission hold, Shields threw some punches from his back as he was clearly frustrated from all the foul play that Palhares had done en route to defending his belt that night. But this move was the last straw. It was so bad that after the fight, World Series of Fighting stripped Palhares of his belt and suspended him indefinitely. Furthermore, World Series of Fighting Vice President came out publicly to say the following quote about Palhares: "Palhares has mental problems and shouldn't be allowed to fight until he fixes them." Now, of course, for fans who dislike Palhares, they had their fair share of entertainment, as throughout his MMA career, several fighters were able to figure out his game and defeat him. A lot of these came in devastating knockout fashion, a trend that grew worse later in Palhares' career as he suffered several losses. He is currently riding a 3-fight losing streak where he was either KO'd or TKO'd. So it seems like fighting dirty doesn't lead to a ton of success, as Palhares never really reached the upper echelon in the UFC and instead came to be known as one of the dirtiest fighters in UFC history. This also led to a ton of fan backlash and general dislike of Palhares, who could have a storybook rags for riches story as he possessed the skills to be elite. If only he could have reined in his dirty tactics and followed the rules. So if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the little bell beside it so that you're notified the next time we upload a new video. With that being said, you just watched us break down one of the dirtiest fighters in MMA history, Rousimar Palhares.